forests to me are my spiritual place. It's where I go to relax, to reset myself, to reconnect. And climate change doesn't mean that we're going to lose all of our forests. Again, it just might mean that there's a different forest, or in case of parts of Canada, say in Alberta, maybe more grassland than forest. But there'll always be something there. And so to me, though, again, it's more about forests are not just trees, right? It's the complex system which gives us everything that we see out there. And that's the harder part. Like, how do we make sure that we're still achieving those goals and do we have the knowledge to simply, to do that in terms of, can we adapt the forest and still make sure it's truly a forest? I don't know.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoph. On this podcast, we talk about environmental sciences. Today, I brought on Jason Edwards. Jason Edwards is a researcher with the federal government, and he's been working and collaborating with a bunch of other researchers, a bunch of other people. They've been creating a framework for climate adaptation for forest industry and environmental sciences. And it's really trying to get at the point of changing hearts and changing minds and getting people to think about it, because this question of how do we adapt to climate change is not set in stone. It's really just getting started. And the reality is it's up to the people that are working on the landscape now to start making these changes. Actually, not long after we recorded this episode, a report came out, and it's official. The atmospheric CO2 just exceeded 415 parts per million for the first time in human history. We have not seen a planet like this before. The entirety of human evolution, over 3 million years, we have not seen this amount of CO2. So the effects of this can't be understated. At this point, it's more important than ever that we focus on climate adaptation. Obviously, mitigation is extremely important. We need to mitigate it as much as possible, but we can't deny it anymore. We're going to see the effects of this for generations to come, so we need to learn how to adapt to it. So, that's why I brought on Jason. So we're going to talk about climate adaptation and how we can begin to start to think this way and accept that our world is going to change, and we need to be ready for that. So it was a great conversation with Jason. I appreciated him coming on so much. It was really good to get him in, and I think we're going to have to do another one in the future here sometime, maybe with a case study or something like that. Sponsors for this episode, Greenlink Forestry was the original sponsor. Thank you so much. They gave me a place to do this and the opportunity, so I can't thank you enough for giving me the chance to get this going. I appreciate it. And then also Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is an apparel company supporting environmental sciences through the sale of their clothing. So they give 10% of all their profit, put it towards a environmental sciences scholarship for students going into environmental sciences of some kind. You can go to damagedtimber.com. The scholarship is on there, so you can apply for it there. Also, put in Your Forest 10 at checkout after you buy a hat or toque, or everything there is awesome. They have really good quality. He really makes sure to hit on the quality aspect. That's kind of his focus. He doesn't want to have a crappy product, so it's great. And then the number one sponsor for this year, for 2019, is West Fraser. West Fraser's funds are made available through the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta, and I couldn't thank West Fraser enough for their support. It really means a lot that industry is supporting this, this endeavor of getting the good science and good information out there for people to understand the good work that's being done. So, without any further mess around, let's get into it. Jason Edwards and I talking about climate adaptation and climate change. So let's do this. Here we go. So why don't we just start talking about yourself? Tell me about how you got into climate science and what brought you to the table today.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you. My name's Jason Edwards. I work with the Canadian Forest Service out of Edmonton here, and climate science. It's kind of a funny route actually for me. I did my undergrad at U of A in forest ecology.
Okay.
ecology generally, with a little bit of a focus on forests. From there, kind of just got a job as a summer student, actually hiking in the mountains all summer long was my first summer job, which is not related to forest directly.
Yeah.
But it got me outdoors, got me very interested in all my surroundings, which
What were you
obviously...
doing? Just hiking for the sake of hiking?
No,
Getting
no,
paid
it was,
for
it was, well, I was getting paid for it, fortunately. But it was for some mountain, lake and alpine ecology studies that were ongoing for long-term trends study at U of A. Anyways, from there, I got another job with the EMEND project. So if you know the Ecosystem Management Emulating Natural Disturbances project.
Yeah, we had Ellen McDonald.
Excellent.
I had her on a while back. But anyways, yeah, we talked about EMEND a little bit then. But so
yeah. So very large project, again, as an undergrad student. But from there, got a job offered as soon as I graduated to coordinate the project.
Nice.
Somehow wound up there for 10 years. Again, not part of climate change directly, more on the biodiversity and forest ecology perspectives. But what an experience. I mean, almost 6 months of my year spent out in the forest for 10 years.
Yeah.
All kinds of interesting experiences.
For sure. That's the way to do it, to get those like on the ground experiences first. For sure.
Well, exactly. And rooted, I think, in a nice... mix of practical application in forestry with the science end as well, right? So some really good understanding of how forests develop and change over time, as well as some of the big questions about what needs to be addressed there in terms of practice. But of course, 10 years is a long time, and family starts coming up, and the need to put down some more solid roots in one place rather than being gone for 6 months. And the job opportunity came up for application at the Canadian Forest Service for a knowledge exchange officer and adaptation researcher at the Edmonton office there. And so, I applied and was fortunate enough to get that one. So didn't come at the job with a direct climate change background. But I think it was more my experience at the EMEND area that around that, the practice, science to practice management partnership idea. That was really my draw there, and probably one of the reasons I guess I was maybe selected for that job is the work of climate change adaptation is really focused on that partnership relationship development piece between science and practice.
Right.
And bringing that to the table, I think, was something that they were looking for, and it's kind of been my focus for the last 8 years.
Well, it's pretty tough to get away from the concept of climate change if you're in any kind of environmental sciences field. Like it's in everything. It's not, you know what I mean? It's not like it's one area of study that nobody else is looking at it. It's literally a part of every part of it because it's all encompassing, right?
Well, it is. All of our ecosystems, of course, are great integrators of climate and weather and rain and temperatures and extremes, you name it, right? That's what shapes all of our ecosystems. And if we're going to be studying those systems, we need to know about how climate drives them.
Yeah.
And I would say that climate science is its own thing, and it has been traditionally its own thing, standing alone more on the meteorological side than on the forestry and ecosystem side for a lot of decades. But as we're noticing more and more changes, I think the more and more need there is to understand climate and the way it shapes all of our ecosystems, including, of course, forests in Canada. So,
and everything. Yeah. And I think that's the point, right? Is that now, even if you're not in this industry or in a researcher or whatever, right? Like everyone's noticing that there's more wildfires, that there's more hurricanes, there's more, and you know what I mean? It seems like that's been correlated pretty concretely with, increased carbon in the atmosphere and everything else. So it's kind of, it's hard to deny that it's happening now. So
I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence contrary to that. So,
right.
And I think even without the extreme events of wildfires and hurricanes and the big floods, in forests, it's a lot of times it's a little bit more subtle than that. If we look just at that forest dieback in the West, for example, with our aspen forests, and now looking at our spruce as well. Mountain pine beetle was another example of sort of just a small, subtle change in climate with some fairly large, drastic outcomes.
Yeah.
But the change was so small, right? I
Right.
mean, it's only parts of a degree of change in temperature over a couple of summers.
Yeah.
And winters and mixed with other aspects to the system too. But as a driver, it magnified itself, right?
Right.
So,
Well, just like you said, just that slight change in mean animal temperature allowed the insects to just propagate more successfully, and they just took off across the whole West. I mean, I'm pretty sure that the current like pine beetle epidemic was kind of hitherto unknown, right? Like it was not we're never known to have that kind of an epidemic that took over so much of the pine forest in BC and Alberta, right? Like it was, so it's almost directly, attributed to climate impact anyways, right? So, but yeah, it's just, I think it's important to point out that I don't think anybody's really, denying that we need to start taking this seriously anymore.
Well, yeah, again, even in my 8 years of working directly on this topic, I'd say it's definitely changed in terms of the awareness of it and the need to act now.
Oh yeah.
When I first started, it was sort of, it's okay, I get it. But I've got many other pressing issues today, as a forester speaking to me. But now we're getting more and more people coming saying, we need to deal with this now. It's now one of our top issues that we have to get a handle on.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's been a big change, I guess, in the 8 years I've been with CFS on this topic. And
it's awesome to hear that you've seen that change in 8
absolutely
years, right?
Yeah.
So I noticed a societal change, I think, but it's cool to notice that like you yourself in your niche have also noticed the same thing, right? So
yeah, and some of that can be attributed to things that they're facing on a daily basis now, or at least a seasonal basis with forest harvesting. A couple of places I've heard of that with a slight change in the seasons, so fall's starting up a little bit later, spring's coming earlier. Sometimes the ground doesn't even freeze in winter anymore in some areas of Canada. And if we're doing all of our winter operations, what are you going to do if you can't get machinery into the forest, if you can't do the forest harvesting, and or if you can't get the trees and the logs out of the forest to the mill because of early spring thaw? They're facing those issues now, right?
Yeah.
And they're feeling it on the mill side with the economic pinch. Mm-hmm. And when you start getting to that level,
yeah.
in the operational impacts, people start to notice, and they really start to drive their interest in trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I think that leads in pretty nicely into like one of the first real questions I had was, like why should the common person care about climate adaptation and whatever that means, right? Why should in a world where we're focusing so much on mitigation, right? So trying to slow climate change down, trying to reduce our impact through, lessening our emissions or whatever it is, or eating less meat or whatever, right? And then also resilience. So like the technology side of it, all kinds of carbon scrubbers and all kinds of different stuff like that. But I think why should people care about, because a lot of people might have a false sense of security that way, right? Where they think that, well, through technology and mitigation, I think we'll be fine. We'll be all right. So what would you say to those people? Why should they give a shit?
Why should they give a shit? Well, I'll take it from the forest perspective.
It gets us in the right mindset, I think, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's appropriate. I mean, it's a big question, and it's quite a big issue, and it's a big challenge. Why do we care about adaptation? For the most part, let's just say that forests are being looked upon globally as one of our main opportunities to mitigate climate change, carbon dioxide. They suck up a lot of carbon. At the same time, at least in our portion of the world, in Canada, a lot of our forests are going to face some fairly significant issues and impacts, I think, as a result of a slightly warmer climate that will challenge that notion of using forests as our number one mitigative opportunity. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means that we need to be aware of what those impacts might be, and then through adaptation, which is doing things differently, be able to ensure that we have good, healthy forests on the land base to help be some of that, to help suck up some of that carbon.
Right. So I guess in a very basic sense, it's kind of, the idea is that right now our current forests are kind of holding some of that climate change at bay a little bit by continuing to suck up a certain amount of carbon from the atmosphere. And as the temperature increases, we're going to see more forests die back, and therefore less forests to take up carbon, and therefore increasing the speed at which climate change happens, right? So the argument is that if we can maintain that forest not the way it is, but in a relatively similar size or similar capacity, that we can somehow help mitigate that increased change, I suppose, right? That was a really confusing way to say it.
Well, exactly. I mean, and this is where other researchers in CFS, for sure, in terms of that mitigation, carbon balance, Werner Kurtz would be the prime example there, that can really tell you just how much and where forests are sucking up the carbon versus giving it off in Canada. But again, the idea is that if our systems are starting to change a little bit, if we are starting to see a little bit more fire, a little bit more forest pests, a little bit more drought die back, what does that mean then for our ability to use forests as the carbon sinks? Also, we know that different age classes of forest suck up carbon differently than others. So maybe a newer, younger forest in certain areas are actually better, and they have increased growth per hectare and increased productivity. There's all kinds of little questions there that others are wrestling with. But again, the idea of adaptation then is to make sure that we understand what those impacts are and what we as forest managers or forest sector can do to ensure that that stays there on the land base, right? That we aren't losing and becoming more of a source than a sink.
Right.
So that's the notion of connecting adaptation to mitigation there, right? And I've even heard a few people say that there will not be sufficient forest mitigation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere without adaptation.
Right.
We have to get a handle on this. We have to understand what climate change means to our forests and what we can do differently to ensure that we maintain those forests on the land base.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm going to move a question forward. I think this is a good time to ask
Sure,
it.
sure.
It's the question of sustainability when it comes to that sense, right? So I think this kind of is a good precursor to kind of the rest of the conversation we're going to have around the framework and stuff. So how does the idea of sustainability seen as conservation, kind of maintaining the status quo, making sure that this continues on for generations and generations and perpetuity forever kind of thing. But if we know that we're not going to be able to maintain the status quo because of climate change, what does that mean for sustainability? Like, does that change it somehow, or I don't know. What do you think? I just think it's a question that people.
Yeah, I mean, what is sustainability, right? So that's a big question.
Yeah, it is.
I don't know.
I think we'll get the big ones out of the way, and then we can focus on the more particular stuff.
Yeah, I mean, sustainability is I guess in the nutshell, kind of what you mentioned. It's making sure that we can maintain and what we value and what we derive from our natural resources into the long term. Now, when it comes to, say, forest management, Canada is a very strong player in the idea of sustainability and sustainable forest management. We help define what sustainable forest management looks like and what it is. If you look at our Canadian Council of Forest Ministers criteria and indicators of sustainable forest management, you're looking at things like biodiversity, soil and water, cultural societal impacts, benefits, not impacts. And, so it's kind of the whole gamut of what we value and what we gain from our forests. And when we look at things like climate change and how it might impact that, the nice thing about that notion is that sustainability is defined as we need it to be defined, right? So what do we value around biological diversity, right? We want to make sure that we have enough and that it's the right kind and it will help generate the forests of the future. What do we value around carbon and carbon uptake of the forest? We can define those things and they change over time through discussions and through ongoing public discourse, right? So these 6 criterion indicators that were originally defined, they didn't just come out of nowhere. They came out of a fairly well-defined process about how you actually derive those values and objectives.
Right.
More locally, at least in let's say in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the forest management planning process, that's how we define it. We define it around those criterion indicators as defined by the CCFM, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. And we have to achieve and define and achieve certain targets around each of those criteria and indicators. But again, it's kind of locally defined, and it's up for conversation, right? There's no right answer to what is sustainable. It is adaptable in its own mind, and it is its own concept. In our minds, it's adaptable. But you want to have some baseline. You want to have some connection to reality there too.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Yeah.
So what is sustainability? Well, it's what we make it.
Right.
But again, in the essence, as long as we're getting off the land what we value, and that we're able to use the land for what we want and value, then I think we're being sustainable. Does it mean that we're going to have exactly the same forest in that location in 100 years? Probably not.
Right.
But that might be unrealistic anyways. The boreal forest is such a dynamic system. It's constantly, just being disturbed, regrowing, but it may or may not be exactly the same in the same place all the time, right? You're switching from a spruce and pine forest to an aspen forest, for example, after a fire, right? So it's always dynamic. It's always changing. We got to think broadly and hopefully look at those big targets.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it, though, too, is because it's not a static system, right?
Right.
It is always changing, so that allows for a lot of flexibility in the system itself. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, the ecosystem is dynamic. The question is our systems, which use the ecosystem, dynamic and able to adapt to it, right?
Yeah.
And that's been the focus of my work, actually, is around sustainable forest management in a changing climate. So, yes, things will change, but are we able to change with it? And more importantly, do we wait until something happens and then just react to that change? Or can we take a more proactive approach to it and try to get a handle on, well, what do you think is going to happen in the future? And what does that mean for our both our sustainable forest management definitions and objectives and targets, but also operationally, what does that mean for us? And how do we get a head start on what makes the best bang for the buck in terms of doing things differently?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense because yeah, exactly. You want to get ahead of it before it catches up to you and you're trying to play catch up and losing all kinds of limbs here and there.
Well, I mean, and that's the idea. And I think we can do it. And it is achievable, but it will require some discussions, a lot of conversation. These are all complex dynamic system concepts and theories that we're trying to deploy in our adaptation work, and nothing is simple, nothing is linear,
for sure.
And so you have to get to understand kind of a deep, complex system thinking process when we start doing this kind of work.
No, for sure, and that's part of the problem, I would imagine, is that policy and legislation is not dynamic, right? It is very set in stone. So to try and change that on the fly is difficult. I imagine that's a huge challenge, but I mean, not that we're going to get into policy and legislation, but
we get to the notions of it. Absolutely.
But the idea of sustainability, I think, that makes perfect sense because it's just, we're trying to, just be sustainable in our activity. Whatever we're doing, we want to try and make sure that that's maintainable over time, even if that is a moving target.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But understanding what that target is still key, right?
So, for sure. I imagine that poses a ridiculous number of challenges to something that is it's already it's not a high margin industry, right? Like it's something that's already, margins are tight, and the people doing research and people working in the industry themselves, they're trying to do what's right and trying to do what's sustainable and doing everything they can, but it's also, there's a limit there, right? There's only so much you can pull off, but
exactly. So it's always a fine balance there. But I'd say that in my, almost 20 years of history and experience now in the forest related sector, mostly on the academic research side, but still embedded in that the real practice side in terms of our partners that we deal with is, they need some real examples. They need some real tangible ways forward. There's always those tight margins, but at the heart of everything is all the people I've ever dealt with have always had the heart of doing things right? Doing it for the long run. Doing it for the best of society, but of course in a way that also makes money for their business, right? Well, and we need to be realistic in this issue as well. So.
And this is something that I parrot all the time, and it might just be my massive bias speaking, or I don't know what, but the way I like to describe it is that a resource is as massive as the forest, right? If you allow the private sector to manage that with regulation and oversight from the government, then you allow that to be done basically for free, right? Whereas if all of a sudden you want the government doing all the management for you, then we're paying for that through all our tax dollars, and you're not going to find the same efficiencies that something that has the motivation to find efficiencies like a private sector does, right? So like they do, and like you said, the people involved their intentions are right. They're trying to do the most sustainable thing over time, because the reason they got into forestry or any environmental sciences, sector, was because they love the outdoors and they want it to be around and they want to use it and they want it to be sustainable and they want to mitigate climate change and all this stuff. So I think it's easy for people to lose sight of that, though, and go like, "Oh, the evil black corporation taking advantage of us," or whatever, right? So,
well, I mean, yeah, there's always different viewpoints. I'll be real frank with you. One of the things that got me into this area, not so much the climate change side, but just the forestry side, is I would say I probably used to share that exact opinion back in high school and maybe early university days, and I started studying what I did study and started getting involved in what I was because I wanted to know more. And also to know that if you want to change the system, you got to be in the system, right?
Yeah.
So, but I quickly learned that viewpoint of the big evil corporation is not necessarily true. At least the people working within that corporation is definitely not true.
For sure, things can happen, right? Like there's always going to be bad situations that happen, but for the most part, everything is going in the right path and trying to do the right thing at all times, right? So, and
forestry is a grand experiment. We're always having to learn as we go, and there will be some failures here and there in terms of operations and things that didn't go quite right. But the idea is, are you learning from it? And if you are, we're being adaptable. That's the big thing, right?
Totally.
And in terms of adaptive management, those notions are there. But again, you're aiming for the right target, right? You're aiming for the long run, the sustainability of the resource and from all those values, not just from the timber value.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's what gives me a lot of pride in being in this industry, though, as well. Is just because I do see there is so much research and so much going into it, and it is adaptive and it is changing because of all of these inputs, right?
Absolutely.
So it is awesome to see that. We talk this big talk, but it is actually working out that way on the landscape too, right? So it's cool. But we should get back onto climate change.
I was just going to say, little digression. But let's bring it back up to we started that little sidetrack with governance and policy regulation, and so yes. When we talk adaptation, it's really about just doing something differently. Now, why is, it can be climate change, it might be market change, it might be who knows what. Something is going to drive our system into some other different direction. In this case, climate change is the driver, is what we're focusing on. But a governance is a big piece of that, of that issue in terms of climate change and adaptation. And, are the policies and regulations always set in stone? No, not always. It depends where you are. All the different jurisdictions in Canada, so that the provinces and territories, they all have their own way of doing things. Some are more flexible than others. Some are learning faster than others. Some have greater capacity to address those governance issues. Whether we look at private versus public ownership and rights, all those are big questions that I think climate change will drive some of the questions to come to the surface again.
Oh, for sure.
Right? Like, how do we deal with this problem? And is it best in the private industry to deal with it? Is it best for the government to deal with it? Is there a happy medium in there somewhere in between? What is the right governance structure for a certain area? There's no right answer, right?
No.
And it will not be the same everywhere in Canada. But we have to find a way to, I think, to really question those things. Are we flexible enough? Do we have the right approaches? Are we able to do things differently when we need to do them? And the way I look at that, though, is there is no right answer, and those are big movements in terms of forestry. Some on the list of adaptation options, those will be the bigger, longer term things probably.
Right. Yeah.
But it all starts with the conversation, right? It all starts with the conversation that we're seeing things change, that industry might be having issues in terms of operational issues and costs are going up. If you don't have the conversation, though, with the regulators, with the governments, and the practitioners and the people and the public, right, we'll never get to that kind of that adaptation at that level.
Yeah.
And those are big topics, big conversations. So the process that we developed through the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, which we haven't really talked about yet, that's sort of one of the the main outcomes that we hope to achieve with our process of adaptation is to start that conversation,
Right.
At all levels.
Right.
Find a way to make sure that people have the same understanding in that conversation, so that we're not just battling on details of data and science.
The same baseline.
Same baseline, right?
Yeah.
To start from, so that when it gets time to those big questions about, well, boy, how do we actually manage and govern the land? Hopefully we've started a bit of a relationship
Yeah, for sure.
around those people, and those kinds of conversations can move forward. And we've been finding some early successes in Canada, actually. A couple of provinces are getting embedded with some of these adaptation processes that we've started in different areas of Canada. So they're kind of watching from the sidelines a little bit with the industry taking on some adaptation work, or they're embedded right at the start of that adaptation work. So they're part of that conversation, and they recognize where the barriers and gaps are and issues are from the regulatory side, and are able to say, yeah, we can go in a different direction, or maybe we can't.
Yeah.
Right. But if you can't, that's fine. It's a defined answer.
Yeah.
And we find another route. Right.
No, exactly. Yeah.
But I do find that early on, traditionally on the governance policy side, it's always kind of one of those things where the industry and the provinces, sometimes they're like, well, they're moving at two different speeds sometimes, and not always meeting in the middle. And that's just the way it is. It's not wrong. But finding a way to match those things up is absolutely key on that particular issue.
For sure. So how would somebody say, how do we go about creating this adaptation process? Like, where do you think the best place is to start? Right. So like we were talking earlier, and we were talking about, like, what do I see as adaptation? Right. And in my mind, I'm imagining, we're adapting the forest so that the industry doesn't, you know what I mean? Like we'll kind of follow the forest trend. Right. But it sounds like, and from what I was reading through the literature there, it sounds like the focus needs to be more on the actual industry itself and changing the way we do things, and not really worry so much about where to plant which tree and that kind of stuff.
I wouldn't say there's a more or less on either of those.
Oh, okay.
We need both, right? Yeah. Yes. So do we adapt the forests to meet our expected needs, or do we adapt our management systems to deal with our expected changes in the forest, right? So there's two approaches to that, two different lenses and angles. Neither one's wrong. You need them both. Because let's just look at the forest side, for example. If we think we're going to adapt our forests, I'd say that we kind of, in one way, we might already be doing that with our existing practices. We harvest an area, and when we reforest that area, it's using seeds from a certain area that's defined. But it's limited. It's a policy and regulation that says you will use seed from this area.
Making sure that the genetics and the local, I guess the local ecosystem has this exact kind of a similar species, or not similar species, similar genetic crop coming back.
Exactly.
It's not something weird from the East Coast growing in the Rockies or something. Right?
Exactly. So right. So that's why that's there. It's probably very useful policy from that standpoint. But at the same time, we're planting trees in the ground from a certain stock, from a certain seed area. And so we're already kind of defining that, right? We're saying and we're doing that across the landscape within a forested management area. And again, there's nothing wrong. We're picking often the best stock that will grow the quickest, right?
Yep.
Make sure it's well established. Those are the goals and objectives that are defined, and everybody seems to be okay with them.
Productivity is a big part of it, yeah.
And that's okay. Now, thinking about it from a climate change perspective, is it the right stock? Is it the right density? All these kinds of questions that we have to now start thinking again about is like, well, what do we do? All this work we did over the last 10, 15, 20 years, is that all at risk now, right?
Right.
Based on what we chose. Now, some areas on the forest side, we are getting much better understanding of genetics. Sally Aiken's work out of UBC and her colleagues on the tree adaptation work. Fantastic, really interesting work, targeted at that, right, at the tree level.
Right.
Genetics and adaptation. But if we start going that route, and we select, say, for drought resistance, do we also know that it's good for pest resistance?
Yeah.
Right. And other issues that might crop up in terms of this changing climate. And so do we have the right knowledge to really say we're adapting the forest, right? I don't know. I'm posing that as a question. We're getting there. We're working on it. But I think the lower hanging fruit is how do we manage the forests, and are we adaptable in the way we do it?
Change our system.
Our system in the way that, and that goes down to changing our objectives, changing our understanding of it, of the system. That's the part that I've been working on. It's a little different question.
Yeah.
And so if the forest is going to change in a certain direction as a result of climate change, can we adapt to that? Do we have the right capacity to understand what that is, what those changes might be? Do we have the understanding and the capacity in the mill side to deal with, say, new products, new species, whatever might come our way? You name it, right? It's a big picture thing.
Totally.
And you asked me, though, going back, where do we start? Right? I don't remember the question I'm supposed to be answering. Where do we start? We start now, and we start small, right? And we start with our existing forest management plans. Okay. So if you're looking at, say, at an industry group starting on adaptation, and so the adaptation process, we have a lot of knowledge already. We already know our landscapes. We know our forests. We know the productivity. We know almost everything we think we need to know to get started on that issue from a forest management company on a company side. Because of our forest management planning processes already in place, right? We have to do that under the law to have the license to manage and to harvest the forest. And I guess for the broader audiences, the forest management planning process is where you actually submit a plan to the government that says, here's your resource and here's what we're going to do with it, and it's approved.
Yeah, and that's considering all those sustainable forest management criteria we talked about earlier, from soil and water to social and economic benefits to whatever, forest productivity, biodiversity, and
exactly,
all those other, making sure that all of the values are accounted for. Like, I'm not sure if multiple use values like recreation are considered in
many of them are, and again, that varies across Canada, but at least here in Alberta, that's definitely true.
It's an all-encompassing plan.
Plan.
Yeah,
and you have to submit those every 10 to 20 years, depending on what your cycle is, and so that is a perfect time to do it. It's when you're already opening up all the details of your forest management operations and planning and the long-term horizon pieces. You're doing your modeling, you're doing your future forest forecasts. Now it's time to think, well, what does climate change mean, right?
Yeah.
So what does climate change mean to those objectives that we're setting in this objective? Will we meet those objectives knowing what we think we know about climate change?
One on a very basic level, just to explain to people that, like, if they've been listening to this podcast, or if this is their first time listening to it, I don't know. But what we're supposedly supposed to be cutting is only the growth, right? Like, every year, forest companies cut the difference between what they had last year and what they will have at the end of the growing season. So that's what's being cut, is so that we're not cutting more than what's sustainable or whatever, right? So with climate change, the concept is that will be changing. Some places might grow more, some places it might grow less. And what is that change, and how do we adapt to it? And if that's a very basic, that's the basic question, I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It goes down the rabbit hole from there.
Yeah. This is why I don't know how much do we need to explain to the whole process. But the idea here is that, the forest companies with approval from the government have a pretty good handle on where they think they're going with things in the future, and then how much they can harvest to make sure it's sustainable. But yes, climate change might question that, right? And so,
is that something that's currently in the plan? Do you know? I actually don't know the answer to this question. Whether or not they're already putting indicators for climate change and expected effects on their growing stock and stuff. I'm not sure if it's in there yet or not, but I imagine it will be soon if it's not already.
I haven't run across any examples where it has been directly put in. Or if it has, where it's been part of the approved plan.
Right.
It doesn't mean that it wasn't looked at.
Right.
It's just that it may not be part of the approved plan going forward.
And that has more to do with red tape and everything else than
Well, and I think it has to do a little bit with, again, that do we have enough knowledge to really say things in order to make it in order for us to have to do something differently, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where there's always this a little bit of push and pull of kind of pushing the edge and envelope a little bit in terms of our knowledge that we incorporate into these types of plans versus, what do we actually know now?
Yeah.
And that's a part of that dialogue where you're always trying to figure that out, right? But
Yep.
I don't want to put too many words in. I'm not a policy regulatory person, so
And that's boring. We don't want to talk about it anyways.
hey, some people find it very interesting. The whole point, though, is that we've been using the past to predict the future in those plans, right? And that past is, say, like the last 50, 60 years worth of growth, and we have good ways of measuring what that was, and currently is in our forests. But in a changing climate, can we use that past to now predict or forecast the future growth? And that's the part where I think we're going to run into questions. Is it a valid assumption that knowing what we know now, our climate has moved a couple of degrees, according to a new recent report here by the federal government this last week. Does that make sense now? Like, can we use our current conditions, using the past as how we got here, to also forecast the future? And I don't think we can.
Right.
Not without some questions that have to be addressed, right? And some assumptions there, I think.
Yeah.
And so again, walking through sort of that process of adaptation, it's like, well, what does climate change mean then to those baseline assumptions in terms of, say, the productivity value that we're writing down, objective that we have in our forest management plan? So if we're writing that we will maintain our forests in the same productive manner, so the same amount of productivity over time as it has in the past, is that a valid objective with a changing climate, right? That's the kind of questions you're going to ask in this process. And that goes the same thing for wild soil and water, right? And given our objectives that we say we're going to maintain this type of thing in our forest management area, now what with changing climate, does that make sense? Is that assumption valid? And is that objective valid?
And then it requires a million different papers to determine whether or not it is.
Not necessarily. We have a tremendous amount of knowledge, and we may not be utilizing everything we know already, right? So again, it drives new questions, but I think it adds some robustness to our forest management when we start asking those questions. And the whole idea of the adaptation process then is understanding, using those kinds of questions to generate, well, what do we not know, right?
Yeah.
And what do we need to address still? And what are our uncertainties of the future? And if we can't predict using the past anymore, what are we going to do? I mean, if that's the basis of our forest management structure and planning, what else can we do, right? And we have other techniques called scenario planning and other ways to look at these problems. But again, that we're not necessarily trained on it, right? It's new ways of looking at the issue. And so we have to step back a little bit and kind of critically evaluate, how do we do our business? And are there different ways of doing this? And that's the adaptation process, right? You're starting with those kinds of questions. But you can do it by starting small. Pick one objective and just think about it. At a small staff meeting. Well, what does it mean? Right,
exactly.
Right? And you don't have to go through this great big elaborate process, which, by the way, we call vulnerability assessment in the work that we've done, to really know what to do and where to start. Right? Start small.
Just on a little aside, and then I want to continue on that thought before I forget. But so the current, I think I read through the executive summary of the current climate report that the federal government put out. And it said roughly 2 degrees or 1.7 degrees of warming, I think we're at.
Pretty close,
as a mean average kind of thing. But correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that even if we stopped all emissions today, if we stopped everything, industrial emissions and cow farts and everything else stopped today, what I've read from multiple different sources was saying that we could expect the climate, the mean annual temperature for the globe to still go up to 4 or maybe even, I think it was around 4 degrees, right? So even doubling from what it's currently at. And then from there, we're still waiting on the actual environment itself, like the trees and the ecosystems to catch up to that. And that could take centuries, right? So even if we stop today, we're still going to see impacts going into for the rest of our lives for sure, right? So I think that's an important thing just to point out, because I think people think that, if we, maybe if we get on top of this right away, we can stop it from changing too much. But we're already on a path where it's kind of it's kind of gone, right? So we have to
Yeah.
not to say we don't have to still try really hard to keep it from getting uninhabitable on this planet, but
Well, yeah, we don't want to get too doomsday either here.
Yeah.
But well, I think honestly, the new report's just coming out. It's the Changing Climate Canada report from Environment Canada. So yeah, all the details will be there. But let's just go back to David Price, who's a research scientist in our office in Edmonton here at the Canadian Forest Service, who's a climate modeler, and I think he was on your podcast here a number of episodes ago. And yes, I think he would
episode 20, I think.
Sure, exactly. You would know. But anyways, he would, I think, confirm that. I think he actually stated that right in his podcast, and he states it all over the place when I go to meetings with him. Is that yes, we are locked into a trajectory here in Canada of a number of degrees of warming yet until 2050. So if we stopped everything, today we are locked into that trajectory, and that doesn't really mean anything necessarily on its own right, with the exception that we are starting to see the impacts already today. Right, the impacts part is not in the future either.
Right.
And again, I think we alluded to that earlier on in the podcast here that we're starting to see that connection between increased insect outbreaks, increased fires, or at least fire severity. A lot of these are weather-driven events, but they're connected to the climate when it becomes multiple years in a row kind of thing, right? And so as the climate's a long-term, like 30-year average of the seasonal, the weather basically, right? Yep. So as the weather starts to weird and we get some more extremes coming and going, it's those kinds of impacts that we're starting to see now, and connecting that to the forest. And yeah, some things are immediate, some things are a lag, right? That's again, all these ideas that this connection between climate and forest is not a linear thing. It's a very dynamic.
Well, it takes time for things to adjust.
It's interactive, right? Iterative and interactive and losing my mind here for the words. Integrative, sorry, that's the word I'm looking for. And like they're a great integrator of all the variables, right? The weather, the insects, the light, everything you name it, as it grows through the dynamics of a forest. All these pieces are what makes a tree what it is today, right? But it's stuff that's happened
in the past,
decades ago.
Would it be fair to say that the impacts that we're seeing from climate change today are a result of what was going on in like the 60s or 70s or something like that?
I don't think that's quite right, but the trees that we have there, right, are a product of the climate from when they were being established, right, from a seedling and as they were developing through the forest stand dynamic process.
Okay.
And so the impacts are not necessarily directly, like it's not a direct thing.
It's not,
right?
It's
just that maybe their ability to deal with the current climate is locked in history, right? It's locked from when they were survived as a seedling to grow into their mature trees now.
Gotcha.
And so there's that disconnect between what they were, I say, selected for, if you will, from the natural selection of their environment, compared to where we are today with 2 degrees warmer.
It's drastically
we're not quite that warm since that period, but anyways, it's warmer.
Yeah.
That's a change, right? And again, that might be okay for the tree as it stands now, but what about the regeneration of that forest, right? If there's not a disturbance, and are the genetics right that it can find, that the seeds will be, there'll be enough genetic diversity there to actually grow a forest into the future with the new conditions.
Right. No, totally. That makes sense. Okay, good. I just wanted to get that out of the way. No problem.
Yeah, sorry. I was drying out there.
No, it's all good. No worries. So then going on that last thought before I interrupted you and asked a random question that was out of focus. So we were talking about how kind of how overwhelming the problem can be, and how it can be difficult to find a focus point for people involved in this, in the industry or in research or whatever, a focus point to try to begin to make this an adaptation, right? So, so you were saying small things. So like, how can we, like, what would you say to a manager today? Like, well, how should you start to integrate this into the practice, and how can we? The way I was thinking about it previously was that. And I don't know if this is true or not, just kind of something I thought. If I was a manager, I would feel a little overwhelmed and a little bit unempowered regarding my ability to affect the change here, because of the way things have been done and the lack of flexibility in the way we do things to try to affect something as big and as unsure as climate change, right? So I would be hesitant to just be like, okay, now we're going to make this big change that's going to be sweeping change. It's going to push us into the future. But I think they're probably hesitant to be called out on it as being wrong or incorrect or something like that. So how do you empower managers to make these decisions and to start, like you were saying, start small? Like, what would you say? What would be something for them to begin with?
Well, I think usually the way you say it begins is just by asking questions, right? Raising awareness. So when we think about it, are we even aware of the issues, right? And if we aren't, that's the first place to start. If you think I don't know anything about climate change,
start reading.
Well, yeah, or asking questions at conferences, or maybe you have. I doubt you have time in your workplace, but ask your buddies down the hall, or ask him or her about what do you know about climate change, and hopefully it's a productive conversation.
Yeah.
And if you don't know anything as an organization, that's an adaptation right there, right? Mm-hmm. How do we learn more?
Right.
Because I find that the awareness and the basic understanding is often the first thing you need to do.
So it starts with the people. Starts with the people understanding the issue.
This is a people issue in my mind. Adaptation, climate change. Yeah. It's nature will do its thing.
Right.
It's about us, right?
Right.
What we value, what we get off the land.
Yeah, why do we care about adaptation?
Why do we care about
because
it?
we want to be able to live on this planet,
and we want to be able to have successful jobs and families and enjoy the nature, right? Yeah. So exactly, going back to the why. But it is that simple. If you don't think you know enough, start asking and start finding. And we have a tremendous amount of resources. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of symposia going on, all kinds of webinars and things that we can learn from. Mm-hmm. So we say, learn from each other, right? Mm-hmm. We have a network out there. It's called the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice. And it was started as part of our Canadian Council of Forest Ministers initiative many years ago. Mm-hmm. And we have a forum on there. If you join, you just type in a question. Hopefully you get a response.
Perfect.
So there are some resources out there like that. And we expect there's going to be a different level of knowledge everywhere, right? Some people are really new to this. Mm-hmm. Others have been working on the issue for a decade or more. Starting small in that sense. Now, in terms of sort of like, what does it mean to me in my business in terms of operations? That part to me is a little bigger question. And yes, it's easy to sort of just say, we just need to plant different stock or a different species out here or find different seed. But doing that is harder than saying that, right? Because do you have the science behind it to know what to do?
Yeah.
Do you have the policies and regulations in place to enable it and support it? Do you have the business support within your company to take that risk?
Yeah.
Right. Those are the doing of it, the implementation of it is hard.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
And so what we've done through the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers Climate Change Task Force was develop a process where you can start to walk through your forest management plan, your objectives, and your operational tactics, mm-hmm. and start to look at those kinds of things. Like, well, what do I need to do differently? And more importantly, where do I first start?
Yeah.
Given this big system, how do I prioritize things, right?
That's what I'm saying. Is like I think lots of people look at this and they go, what the hell? Where do I begin? This
right,
is crazy.
Exactly. And so we've delineated a little bit of a process for doing that. So step one is what we call organizational readiness, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to delve into the details here or not of this frame, but I'll try to do it fairly quick and simply. But step one is really organizational readiness. So that's a little bit about how I started. Like, do you have the right knowledge? Do you have the right enabling factors in your organization mm-hmm. to do things differently if need be? How do you enable people? All the leadership and structure, all that kind of stuff.
For sure.
So it gets to those elements, right?
That's interesting because that's the easiest thing to affect as an individual in an organization, right? Because you can start to have those conversations with your superior or whoever, or even people you're working with, and start to change. Just get people thinking in the right frame of mind, and that'll ultimately, people are the organization. So
exactly.
Change the people, the organization will inevitably change.
That's the idea, right?
Yeah.
And we do know though that without certain key characteristics of an adaptive organization, mm-hmm. if you will, starting the whole process of adaptation is kind of there isn't a start, right? It's a non-starter. Right. So make sure that you're kind of enabled within your role, right? Mm-hmm. To do something. if you feel like that's good and you're able to move forward on something. So, for example, your forest management plan is coming up for renewal. How do you start this, right? Okay, companies said, yep, we want to do this. We want to make sure that it's climate smart.
Yeah.
Go forth and prosper.
Yeah.
Oh, crap, right?
Yeah.
Now what? So we have this process that kind of walks you through, a guidebook actually that'll walk you through this process, and it's not easy. It's a little bit of complicated. I would say not complex, complicated. It looks onerous, but once you delve into it and get into it, it's actually not that bad.
Right.
There's a lot of kind of self-help guiding questions throughout this process.
Right.
But context is key in adaptation. So when we talk mitigation is global, right? The big carbon dioxide loads in the world and globe, but adaptation is local. So it's really what you're doing within your little area, and that is enabled or inhibited by maybe larger policies and regulations and other issues, but it's within your control, right?
Right.
In many ways. So figuring out what context you are. So in this case, a forest management setting, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a forest management area, that's your context. Well, what does that forest look like in there? You're describing all these things, but you're also listing out there what your key objectives are.
Yeah.
So this is getting back to like, what are we trying to do with this land base, and what are we trying to value off and get off of it, right?
Yeah.
And how do we value it? And clearly making sure those are clearly defined, because most places in Canada it is, but not everywhere.
Right.
Right. Because that's the starting point. Because again, the adaptation will be, well, how do we achieve those into the future? The other struggle I find with a lot of times, and where the big uncertainties come in, is the connection between climate and the forests.
Yeah.
So how do we make that connection? Yes, we know we have a certain forest out there of a certain type. It's mostly aspen, mostly spruce, mix, whatever.
Yep.
But we know what it is. But how do you know how it got there from a climate perspective? Because when we start thinking climate change, when we say, well, it's going to warm and dry and whatever else out there, or maybe get warmer and wetter in certain parts, well, what does that mean then, right, to the forest itself? And you have to draw that connection.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that you need to know all the details, but you need to have that understanding of kind of the general sense of what climate change means to your forest.
Right. So the baseline was kind of always shifting, and just I understand what you're saying, though.
Right. So, but that's the part there where I noticed that when it comes to understanding vulnerabilities and adaptation stuff, that we just get hung up on. There's just too many details, too much.
I mean, it's overwhelming.
It is overwhelming. My job is to try to keep track of the literature of climate change and forests, and I can't. Just no way. So to expect a practitioner to do it, it's hard, right? But we have research scientists in and around all the different institutions that can help on those things, right? Of course, then we have to figure out what the future means, right? And if we can't use the past to predict the future, now what do we do?
Yeah,
so,
totally, yeah.
There's some understanding there, right? Getting to know a different viewpoint and a different way of dealing with the future in terms of projections and scenarios, and a new language and a new understanding. So again, not an easy task, right?
Yeah.
But it comes into the awareness and the learning and the training of people on these types of elements, right? And again, that's being adaptive. It's adaptive capacity, we call it, right?
Yeah. I think that's the funny part about this, because this climate change question, right? It's something that's relatively new in societal, understanding.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people that are coming to realization of the reality of it all, they might go, okay, well, now what do I do? Someone must have figured out the answer to this question. So what do I do? And the reality is, we're still working that out. Like it's
up to us. We got to figure it out. And that's a really key point to all this work, right? Is that I honestly don't. My personal viewpoint on this, from experience, is you don't want to just hand it off to somebody else to do it. Especially from your forest management planning process, you have to be embedded in this process to know what makes sense and where to start and how to get through it, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to do it all, but you have to be as an individual within your organization, you have to be invested in it.
Totally.
Otherwise, in the end, you're going to get information back that's probably might be very good, but it might not be directly implementable to what you need it to be.
Yeah, for sure.
So the idea here that you've forecasted multiple futures, right? So from there you can say, okay, well, looking at our objectives now and looking at what we think the future is going to be like for our forests, what does that mean to achieve our objectives?
Right.
maybe we're fine and it's all good.
Maybe
that'd
be wicked.
I suspect not, right? Yeah. But there might be certain objectives in there that are more vulnerable. We call it that, more at risk of not being able to achieve than others. Right. So right there, you've prioritized now, right? You've got a list of say, okay, well these ones we're pretty okay on, but here's 5 or 6 that we know we're just not going to make.
So expanding on that a little bit, just as another sidetrack.
Sure.
Do you know of specific like ecosystems or specific values that you know of that are of specific concern or specifically vulnerable to this? I mean, arguably everything is, but like you're saying, are there focus points that you could point out that you think people should be starting to think about a little more seriously than others?
Well, I guess I'll use some work from, I'll keep it regionally specific because it's going to vary by regions.
Of course.
But here in Alberta, another researcher at our organization here in Edmonton, Ted Hogg, has been looking at aspen dieback across the prairie provinces.
Okay.
For quite a long time now in a project he calls CIFA by acronym. And he has seen some fairly large impacts as a result of drought many years ago, where we're starting to lose aspen across the land base in many different places. And I think some of the forest industry, at least here in Alberta, are starting to see that as well, and they're starting to ask more questions, right? So that would be one spot, right? The aspen within Alberta.
Right.
Alberta has a really nice delineation between prairie and boreal, right? With a parkland ecosystem in between. And that boundary is sort of what Ted has found is called the climate moisture index he developed. And where it's 0 is where the line between prairie and trees exists.
Okay.
And using future modeling, we can see that has been it can shift north.
Yeah.
And recent trends in climate and drought are showing that it's shifting north as well. That corresponds to trees starting to die back off the land base, right? It's no longer conducive to boreal forest or parkland forest conditions.
Yeah.
So that mix of that little change, right, is showing that it is happening now. It's specific to that forest type. They're starting to expand into spruce now.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So who knows?
Spruce are notoriously like hardy species too. So
generally speaking, right. And then we got mountain pine beetle in the foothills. So I don't know if, at least in the west here, it's going to be.
So every region's going to have their own specific thing that they need to be focused on as far as vulnerability.
Yeah, but again, it depends on what you're valuing, right? So if spruce and aspen or pine are your primarily your dominant species you need for your economics from the mill side, and you're seeing things changing, right? It's going to be an impact here.
That's what you need to, okay.
And it's probably going to impact other values like habitat and things for species at risk habitat and that kind of stuff.
For sure.
So there's the core pieces. So anyways, this process, it's a hard question to answer in a general sense, right? And this is why I say it's context specific. It's local. You need to understand what it means to you and your area. And we have science that will be showing you the larger trends and sometimes the specific areas. We have lots of models that can do all kinds of stuff, but are they relevant in the changing climate? Like those are the pieces that we need to figure out from science, right?
Yeah.
Did that answer? Do you think you're good?
I think so. Yeah, there's only so much we can do with that question.
Exactly. You need to understand what's changing in your land base is the key.
Right. I think it's just one of those things that people want the easy answer, right?
There is no easy answer.
And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that this is something that us as industry professionals or whatever, or people that are in this sector, it's our responsibility to take this seriously and to start talking about it and push it in that direction so that we're ready. And it's already happening now, so we're already behind the 8 ball. So we need to we're already playing catch up. Let's catch up before it's way too far gone. Yeah,
exactly. There's that onus to take some ownership on it, right? Yeah, and it's not. Sure, it's easy to say that, right?
Yeah,
but
be responsible, children.
There you go. Save the world. But you're getting it right on the head there, like you're nailing it there. So that's exactly key. There is no easy answer. It's all new to all of us. It's changing daily, right? Well, not quite daily, but yearly. We're actually seeing these changes, and so we don't really know exactly what to do. There's no prescription, and so as a result of that, we need to find out the best solution that meets our needs, and we can borrow, we can learn from others, right? But does it mean it actually works
Yeah.
for us? Maybe, maybe not. So again, this process we've developed is to try to get you to understand all these pieces and what it means to you and how to prioritize where to start.
Right.
And so we've done that part.
There's a bunch of books about it. I mean, you're looking at a stack. I'm looking at a stack of what?
10 reports, I think.
10 different reports based off of like 10 different specific subjects around adapting.
Yes,
to
exactly.
Right.
Right.
So there's things you can read up on for sure.
And we've tried to, in these reports, we've tried to make them as general as we can to suit all the different contexts of forest management in Canada.
Yeah.
It was a pan-Canadian initiative.
Yeah.
And we tried to summarize a lot of knowledge into some fairly succinct pieces so that it's not too overwhelming.
And this is okay. We need to make sure that we.
But we haven't
link
actually
for this on. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The link. Yeah, I can even tell you. It's the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers works. So www.ccfm.org will get you to the landing page. And then there'll be a climate change link from there.
And it'll be right on there. That'll be these.
And it'll be it's pretty simplistic site because it's a big pan-Canadian government.
It's the one you sent me, right?
It's the one I sent you.
Yeah.
And so it lists all these reports, and what these reports do is it sort of goes into some of the concepts and in theory behind change management, adaptive organizations, and this process we call vulnerability assessment. Which is what we've used to try to get a handle on what does this climate change mean to you, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so we've laid out this framework, and the reports kind of are, they describe elements of that framework as you go through, and then in the end produced what we hoped would be a user's guide, usable user's guide, that I guess in theory a forest manager could just pick up and start working from.
Right.
And yes, you could. We do know that it's not that simple, right? So I was hoping that we'd have a little bit more capacity on our end to help guide and do some work on that. We're not quite there yet, but we have a few others that have used that process out there now across Canada and can definitely be leaned on to help guide. Myself as a resource. I can't get involved in everybody's vulnerability assessment process or adaptation process, but I can help guide some generalities, or if people have questions at the very high level, let me know, that kind of thing. So it's there. But again, how do you prioritize where to start? You got to go through the process.
Yeah.
I don't see any other way of doing it.
Okay.
It's not going to be the most simplistic, easy thing to do. But in the end, what we've learned from a couple of case studies is that the effort put into the doing the process and sitting around and gathering the information together leads to some very tangible, implementable ideas at the end that are tied to the objectives that you're trying to meet, that are tied to business lines and business objectives, and they make sense to you in your context of forest management. And so
that's good. Well, that's what you want. You're trying to do something that's applicable to everybody, so everyone can start to get on board, right? As time goes on, we're going to get better at understanding where to start and but we got to start somewhere. So that makes sense. I think this is actually a big question that I probably should have started with, from the perspective of why should people care about adapting the forest specifically? Somebody who's uninitiated, say someone's not a forest professional, right? And they're listening to this and they're going, why should I care about the forest industry adapting? Right. So just in a very broad sense.
Gotcha.
And I might throw this at the beginning of the episode so that it makes more sense. So what would you say to something as simple as that? Simple. That's a weird weird way to put it. Kind of going backwards in the conversation.
So why should a non-forester be interested or concerned or want to see forestry adaptation occur so that forests will still be there in the future?
There you go.
Well, I guess because to me, I'll just speak personally, forests to me are my spiritual place. It's where I go to relax, to reset myself, to reconnect. And so without forests, I don't know. I mean, there are other areas, sure, great, but they're definitely my thing. And I think a lot of Canadians share that kind of view for whatever personal reason. And climate change doesn't mean that we're going to lose all of our forests. Again, it just might mean that there's a different forest, or in case of parts of Canada, say in Alberta, maybe more grassland than forest. But there'll always be something there. And so to me, though, again, it's more about, what else do you do? Well, I build my house out of wood, right? I still read some paper products. I still, utilize a lot of wood products. And I guess when you look at the new growing sectors in the forest industry of plastics and all kinds of bioenergy, we're going to rely on forests for a lot of things into the near and long-term future. So for the jobs and the economy and everything else, I care a lot.
Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
Beyond just the spiritual end of forests. And so, yeah, we can grow trees. I think we can grow trees anywhere, almost any condition.
Right.
We
could bring in the eucalyptus and have plantations if you really wanted fiber. Yeah.
So if fiber is the end goal and the only goal,
yeah,
then we can do that. Right. But I think in Canadians' view, and probably the world's view, forests are not just trees, right? It's the complex system which gives us everything that we see out there. And that's the harder part. Like, how do we make sure that we're still achieving those goals and do we have the knowledge to simply, to do that in terms of, can we adapt the forest and still make sure it's truly a forest? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just
That's perfect.
Putting that question out, right?
That's exactly what I was hoping to get, was just kind of that context of why people should care, because I think it's easy to lose track of, like we were saying at the very beginning, right? Of it's just this keep it in the black corporation trying to pull fiber and not doesn't care about anything else. But it's all about sustainability, and the thing I parrot constantly throughout this podcast is wood is one of the only truly sustainable resources we have, right? If it's done right through sustainable forest management, then it's environmentally, pro every environmentalist movement you can think of, if you're truly following the science. So it's I think that's kind of what I was getting at, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, we helped define what sustainable forest management is, right? Like, we were part of that process, Montreal process back in the 90s. We are seen as a leader in sustainable forest management. We have the highest area of land that's third-party certified for sustainability through different means. And we're continuously pushing the envelope on what sustainability is in forestry, right? And how we manage. And again, I think we can achieve it. In a changing climate, but it's going to take that little bit of work. It's going to take some effort on all of us, the practitioners, the managers, the researchers, the regulators, to figure out how to do this together, right? For sure. We need to work together on it and come up with the solutions. Yeah,
I think that's perfect, man. I think that was just over an hour. So
should we just stop?
I think we kind of wrapped it up. Yeah,
excellent.
If you do, maybe I'll ask that last question that I was going to ask you, just about. So for people, when you come across people like family members or friends or whatever, people that are maybe completely, totally skeptical or just slightly skeptical about the causes of climate change, how do you approach that situation? Like, say it's somebody that it's a close friend or a family member or something, and you're trying to just get them to understand the context here, and that this is something that's happening, and you know what I mean? Like, what is there an anecdote or something that you use to get them on board, or is there a magic wand that you can swing and go, hey, believe what I believe?
I just walk away.
Yeah.
Deal with the people that believe. No. I don't actually have a nice anecdote. You got to make it personal, I think. Try to make the connection to what they value. And again, to me, it's not about a changing climate. That, yes, it's happening. It's always happened. Whatever you want to come up with the reasoning to not think about it. But what matters is what we derive and what we value off in this case, forests, right? And regardless of if the climate is changing as a result of carbon dioxide increases from human causes or not, whatever the reasoning is behind it, we're seeing changes. And we have to ask ourselves, will we be able to say that we have the forests that we value today into the future, right? Regardless of the change of the cause of climate change.
Yeah.
And, in that case it's forests, but maybe there's another example that they value. I don't know what it be, rivers and canoeing, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So it's drawing that connection again between kind of a changing climate, which is occurring today regardless of the cause, and what they're valuing in terms of life, right?
Yeah.
And what they find exciting and fun.
Totally. No, I mean, it leaves everything wide open, right? Like, I read a thing, and I'm totally paraphrasing because I do not remember where I read this, but I read it recently, and it was something about last time that there was this much carbon in the atmosphere. So we're coming up to what, 400 parts per million, I think.
I think we just crossed it.
Crossed 400 parts. Oh shit!
Don't quote me. Don't quote me, because again, I'm not the climate scientist.
But it's high. It's way higher.
It's high.
As opposed to pre-industrial levels. It was like 240 parts per million, I think. So it's gone up dramatically.
Yeah.
They said last time that through ice cores they measured this or something in Antarctica. The last time that the carbon dioxide levels were this high in the atmosphere, there were trees in Antarctica.
Mm-hmm.
What in the actual F? Like that is, you know what I mean? The context of that is insane to imagine. It's like, does that mean we're going to have trees in Antarctica? It's like, no. It's just saying that's last time that it was here naturally. The levels were that high. That's how warm the planet was. So it's fascinating to think. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of a doom and or I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing to say because it's kind of non-contextual. But
the world changes. Yeah. I mean, we do tend to take a static view. We're here for a very short time, right? And my backyard always used to be this way. Well, now it isn't, right? Mm-hmm. To have that kind of long-term geological perspective, you have to think hard about it, right? Yeah. It doesn't come naturally.
Totally.
Maybe those of us that study those kinds of things and study ecology and those, that's what we like. We understand it a little bit just mm-hmm. innately, and it's why we study what we do. Yeah. Perhaps, but it can blow your mind. The thing that I find, if we're talking to say more back to the skeptics again, mm-hmm. Idea is the rate of change. Like you're talking millions of years ago versus a couple of decades ago in terms of what we are. Like that change that we've had, that increase of CO2 in the short space of time that we've had, I mean decades rather than millennial and millions of years. Mm-hmm. That's the part that is of issue, right? Yeah. And even when you look at, say, other shifts in either climate and or carbon dioxide within, say, the human history, I don't think anything's ever changed that fast.
Right.
And more importantly, we've had more room in the world, right, to move. Mm-hmm. Yeah. and or just people just faded away, whatever happened, right? Mm-hmm. Where now we've definitely created societies that are fairly well structured and all well set in place.
Yeah.
That when you look beyond, let's say, the forestry side, and you start looking at extreme weather and weather events like flooding and hurricanes.
Just human survival side, yeah.
Right. So now that we're all fixed in one place, mm-hmm. Those are the dynamics that have changed that make it an issue today. Yeah. That sure, it's happened in the past, but today's different.
The rate of change.
Today's different.
Another one of those things that I can't remember. It might have been in the David Price episode, but he was talking about the actual rate of change is so dramatic that it's, as far as we know, as far as we research, it is unprecedented. Like we've never seen that rate of change
exactly
by magnitudes.
Exactly.
Right. So it's it's terrifying to think about, but it's good. It's good to know that we're headed in the right direction, and we've got people like yourself and your colleagues working on this kind of stuff, right? And we're starting to see the industries make the change and start to include this, because I mean, if you ultimately an industry's perspective is longevity. Right? And if that's the case, then you have to start planning for the inevitable, which is climate impacts, right? So
yeah, I would say at least the foresters, I think, viewpoint is longevity.
Yeah, right. You got 200-year planning horizons that are built into your model. Yeah, you kind of think it that way, but yeah.
So that's how they're trained, and that's what they believe. So definitely on that side. So yeah, I mean, this issue's big. We're just starting.
Yeah.
But we need everybody to pick up and start moving forward on it.
Yeah, get on board.
Yep,
make the difference.
Exactly.
Awesome, man.
Perfect.
That's perfect.
All right, thank you very much, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. It was that was an interesting conversation to try and discuss those complicated subjects. You know what I'm saying? Remember to rate and review, comment. I'm on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and I think I'm starting to put them on YouTube now too. So make sure to share with your friends. I think that's the best thing that you guys can do for me is just tell a friend about it. Maybe tell a few friends about it. Tell them how much you like it. If you do like it. If you don't like it, then just don't tell anybody, because I don't want to get a bad rep for being a horrible podcast. Anyways, thanks a lot for listening, guys. I appreciate the support, and we will catch you next time.